Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez, the CEO and founder of Epik Project, a nonprofit organization that is nurturing a generation of generative men. Today, we have a very prestigious guest for you, and this is a man whose career I have been following for years. He's very well known. He's a very well-known voice in the global and national anti-trafficking movement. You're going to find out why. John Richmond is an American attorney and diplomat, but from 2018 to 2021, John served as a U.S. ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. He continues to work, or he currently works as a chief impact officer at Atlas Free, one of our best partners. He also serves as president of the Libertas Council, a leadership community focused on combating human trafficking, advancing democracy, and affirming human dignity. Before becoming the CIO at Atlas Free, John joined International Justice Mission and was relocated to India, where he served as a field officer for South India. John pioneered IJM's work to identify human trafficking victims, provide victims protection services, and support the government as they held traffickers accountable. After that, John was sworn in as a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division criminal section. He was a founding member of the department's Human Rights Prosecution Unit. And John prosecuted police misconduct, hate crimes, and labor and sex trafficking crimes. In this episode, I talked to John about what this whole issue looks like at both a national and a global level in the fight against trafficking. He sheds light, really helpful light, on what's working and also, very honestly, what's not from a legal perspective. But he also shares his perspective on the bigger cultural picture and how we as men, husbands, fathers, leaders in our community can use our influence in a hopeful, helpful, and life-giving way. John's story and his wisdom gives us hope to continue in this work of justice. But he's also just a guy who is literally bringing the best of himself into this world in a way that's inspiring for all of us. Please remember today that this is also a conversation that touches on the violence of sexual exploitation. And while it's never our goal to sensationalize the trauma of this topic, we strive to speak truthfully about the damage being done. So thank you again today for joining us as we explore more of the masculine wilderness.
Today, we would like to shout out our partners at Atlas Free. Human trafficking is the fastest growing crime in the world, generating more profit than Walmart, Visa, Amazon, Google, and Apple combined. Atlas Free is on a mission to change that. Help Atlas Free build a global movement that puts sexual exploitation out of business. Learn more at atlasfree.org.
Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to have this conversation today, and it feels like the continuation of a conversation that I had with a really normal dude that I met a few months ago for the first time. I'd heard his name for years, but knew of him for a long time. But we ended up having a long conversation in a hotel in Spain where we were for meetings, and it was the most natural and normal conversation between two guys with gray hair. But then I realized that I was talking to a former U.S. ambassador. This is my guest today, John Richmond. John, your resume says a lot, but just tell us just a little bit about yourself, where you are, family, and maybe just a little bit of a clue as to how you got into this work in the first place.
Tom, it's great to have this conversation with you today, and I really enjoyed connecting while we were in Spain. I'm an attorney by training. I have been in this work of fighting human trafficking for most of my career, and it's taken me all over the world, which I've been incredibly grateful for. I've gotten to do this with my bride. We've been married for a little over 31 years, and we've got 3 robust children, 2 of whom are basically grown, and then we've got 1 more that is climbing through the grades. He's going to be in 8th grade this coming year. And our family has really walked this journey together, thinking about how do we engage the problems of the world and how do we work to solve it? How do we work to make wrong things right? Which is really the whole idea of seeking justice. And it's been fun to do that with them. It's been fun to be able to look at trafficking from a number of different lenses. So I've looked at it from the lens of being an NGO leader in India when I worked for International Justice Mission. We lived there for a little over 3 years, thinking about forced labor and sex trafficking in the Indian context. I got to do it as a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice. It was what an honor for 10 years to get to try sex and labor trafficking cases and other civil rights crimes all over the United States and see NGOs from a perspective of them providing services to the survivors that we were advocating for justice in the court system. And then I worked at the State Department, thinking about this through a foreign policy lens. How do we get governments to pull levers to actually make the changes that are necessary in order for people to find freedom and for perpetrators to be held accountable? So I'm just grateful that I've had this opportunity. I've learned a lot from survivors. I've learned a lot from traffickers that I've gotten to know. And we're still in the fight. We're still trying to figure out how do we continue to make processes and systems better so that the people who are being exploited around the world in commerce are able to come into freedom.
Yeah. Wow. I think it's fascinating and just it's inspirational that you have brought your family along on this journey. And I'm curious, like so when you were in these other places around the world, was it all 3 kids were with you during those seasons, right? And your wife as well.
Yeah. When we moved to India, our daughter, our oldest, was 15 months old. And my wife was pregnant with our second. She actually delivered him in India. So he's my favorite Indian of all billion of them. And then there was an 8-year gap to our third.
Okay.
We've walked along this in an age-appropriate way, but certainly thinking about these ideas and for them to get to meet survivors, for them to get to meet traffickers and understand more about how the system works.
Does your wife have similar background in this work, or is she an attorney, or?
She is not an attorney, although she would be an incredible lawyer. She is an educator by training, and she's not in on all the casework and things like that. Although she has been on an undercover operation with me when we were in India once, and she did a really good job.
How did that impact like your marriage? That's a fascinating career path, and that has an impact on marriage. What did that do for you guys just as a married couple?
Well, in some ways, I think the work has strengthened our marriage in a bunch of ways in terms of the sense of meaningful work, of knowing that the thing that we're out there doing actually matters and being able to share that. But it's also presented some challenges. I know there have been many days where I would pull into my driveway and as I parked my car, I would think about, I need to just like press in my emotional clutch and shift gears, right? I've been doing all this intense work all day, thinking about trauma and abuse and violence. And I'm about to walk into a house where kids are going to sprint across the room and jump into my arms. And they don't need a guy that's saturated with trauma. They need a guy that's ready to engage and play and have a fantastic time until I read them their bedtime story. And just to shift gears, just to like be intentional about saying, I'm going to turn a corner here because what I'm no longer needed as an advocate and a lawyer. For the next 3 hours, I'm needed as a dad and a husband. And I've got to walk in ready to like relieve my wife who's been on duty all day and jump in as a father. And just the discipline of doing that was really important.
How did you learn to do that? I love that idea of pressing the emotional clutch. How did you learn to do that?
I'm not sure, Tom, that I know the answer to that question. I think I learned it from the need. Just thinking about, I want to be excellent at what I do. And so I want to be excellent at what I do at work, but I want to be excellent at what I do at home. I want to be a great dad. And so I don't know that I'm there. My kids will decide that later in life, I guess. But like, I'm going to put it all out there and do my very best. And to do that, you have to intentionally engage. And if we are going to be great at what we do, if we're going to aspire for excellence, it's going to require a ton of intentionality, a lot of discipline, and a lot of saying, what I feel right now is not the most important thing. The most important thing is to do what's best. And not to hide my feelings or not to sweep them under the rug. Everything needs to be processed and dealt with, but it needs to be processed and dealt with in a way that's healthy and where you don't throw those burdens onto other people.
Yeah. That feels like a skill you'd have to learn over and over again throughout life. I mean,
I think so. The other challenge for our marriage that this work has presented is my travel. This work, from the moment I started, has required me to be gone. Even when I lived in India, we were taking trains out to villages to meet victims and find cases and go to court. Travel has been a huge challenge. And there have been seasons where we handled it really well, and there have been seasons where we haven't. And we've had different processes in different seasons to try to put limits and boundaries around it. But this is an incarnational work. In order to do this work effectively, physical presence matters. You've got to be physically present in order to walk with survivors. You've got to be physically present in order to hold traffickers accountable. But you also have to be physically present to be a good husband, as well as to based on fatherhood. It has limited benefits. And so being there matters. And so our most precious resources are time. Yeah. And even in this season, my wife and I talk about travel every few months and just planning out our calendars and trying to see, do we have it right? Is this too much? Is it not? How do we make it work in each new season?
Wow, it feels like some hard-earned wisdom there. I want to just back up a little. You said something that made me think of this. Your professional credentials, anybody that would look at them, we shared them earlier, they're stellar, but is there something more personal, like a particular story, particular event that can explain the trajectory of your career path? Was there a moment or an experience way back when that said, this is my work to do? Can you think of something like that?
Kierkegaard has a great line where he said that life is lived forward and understood backwards. In our trajectory, certainly we didn't set off for this. I didn't grow up thinking I want to fight human trafficking. But I will say there have been several moments, and I think a lot of it stems from growing up in a family where people talked about right and wrong, and people talked about like what is good, and that we want to pursue good. Which good I was going to pursue as a career, I didn't really have clarity on. But when I went to law school, I thought the criminal law was the most interesting stories, the most interesting fact patterns, and constitutional implications were always on the forefront. So I just kept taking those classes. And I think that maybe drove me when I finally had the opportunity to leave my law firm. I worked for about 4 years at a firm, and an opportunity presented itself to go to India with International Justice Mission. And making that big left turn, I had no business taking that job. They had no business offering it to me. I knew nothing about human trafficking, knew very little about India, but was compelled by the scope of the problem. And I was also compelled by this idea that there are so many people that wanted my job. So many who would have loved to have my seat in that law firm. And I bet they're smarter than I am anyway. And they should have it. But there weren't a whole lot of lawyers that wanted to go to India and engage in this work. And so it just felt like there was a scarcity there, and we wanted to lean into it. And then the willingness to keep leaving great jobs to pursue the next great idea. And I feel like I have quit some of the best jobs in the world already, and always on the upswing. Our office in India was thriving, and people who've taken over and who succeeded me have made it even better. But it was thriving when we left. And I felt like we'd done really, really well. We were growing the human trafficking prosecution unit. I'd learned the ropes, it earned some respect, and then to launch out and try something brand new. So I think what's important is always look for that next big idea, that next great turn, even if it's not the most logical or stable turn.
I'm curious if along the way and in making those turns, were there friends or colleagues or family members that looked at you like, what are you doing? Like, did you get pushback from that?
Definitely. Yeah. Everyone, when we left the firm to go to India, everyone thought it was committing career suicide. I mean, I'm leaving a stable, established law firm to go abroad with an NGO no one had heard of at the time. People thought that it was just a terrible decision. And I had no experience doing it. But I think experience is overrated. Everyone remembers, like, it was experts that built the Titanic with lots of experience. It was complete rookies that built the Ark. And so, like, not every time do you need to have already done it before to start.
Yeah. When you went to India, how old were you?
I think I was about 32.
So that's like right at the beginning of that professional kind of the glory years. That's an amazing, left turn. That's a good way to describe it. You should do like conferences on that and inspire other people to take left turns. So one of the other reasons why I was really looking forward to having this conversation with you is you have practiced law and you have been a part of the law enforcement community at a national and a global level. One of the most formative things I ever heard when I got into this work, and I've heard it over and over again over the years, is hearing prosecutors and cops and people in the justice system say things like, we can't arrest our way out of this problem of sexual exploitation. But I've also learned that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take seriously the responsibility to apply the law, hold perpetrators accountable and all that. My question to you is this, from your perspective, whether globally or nationally or both, like, where have you seen the justice system work well, and where have you seen it break down in response to sexual exploitation? Like what's still left to do within that legal environment?
When people make those statements that we're never going to arrest our way out of this problem, we're never going to prosecute our way out of this problem, I always find it to be such an odd concept. Because of course it's true, but it feels like a straw man argument. We're also never going to shelter our way out of this problem. We're not going to raise awareness to solve this problem alone. The idea is we got to do everything. And certainly, I think prosecution is a necessary but not sufficient condition of success. So it is essential to do. And normally when people are saying we're not going to prosecute our way out of this, it's that they want to divert resources from law enforcement and divert efforts away from holding traffickers accountable and put them somewhere else. But the reality is we're not even close to emphasizing prosecution. You're more likely to get arrested as a victim of trafficking than as a trafficker anywhere in the world. It's not as if traffickers are running around scared to death because they're worried about getting caught. The chance of they're more likely to get struck by lightning than prosecuted for their trafficking crimes. And if anything, we need a vastly improved and increased effort to hold traffickers accountable for what they do. In city after city, the vice detectives in any police force, they know who the pimps are and who is being sold. And we need to hold them accountable. We need to stop it. And we need to do it in a serious and consistent way. So I also think we need to have great residential care for survivors. We need to have wraparound services, trauma-informed care. But the efforts to diminish or delete the P of prosecution within that 3P paradigm of prosecution, protection, and prevention, I think those efforts are misplaced. And I think that we need to make sure we emphasize that. As to where things are going well within the criminal justice system, I'm the first to be a critic of our criminal justice system. I think there's lots of ways to improve it. I think we obviously need more trauma-informed investigative strategies that help us make sure that we are being victim-centered as we are going through the process. And lots of trainings have happened. We need to continue to improve that because many in the law enforcement community are constantly being rotated through. They're transitioning their jobs every few years. And so you're always retraining. You're always trying to build up that depth.
Before you get to the next point, for the non-law enforcement and non-people that aren't necessarily involved in this work, can you say a little bit more about what trauma-informed investigative practices, like what are some examples of what that means?
That's a great question. Thanks for pausing me on that. I think when we think about most criminal activity, you're focused on event-based investigations. So you're focused on, like, when was the bank robbed? Who robbed the bank? And we have a date and a time to work around. The challenge of exploitation is that it's a process-based crime, not an event-based crime. The trafficking situation, the grooming, the recruiting, the coercion, that can take place over months, can take place over years, even decades. And the type of coercion used at one phase of the trafficking might look different later on in a subsequent phase. And so learning how to investigate crimes that are process-based takes a little more time. And then you add on to that the fact that the people you're talking to, the potential victims that you're trying to determine, are they a victim of this offense or not, are not inclined to tell you the truth immediately. They're resistant. They have experienced something that is incredibly difficult and causes them to behave differently. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
When my daughter was young, she had a bike that she loved. If someone had stolen her bike, she would have run to me. She would have wanted to call the local police department in our town. They would have come out. She would have given them an incredible description of her bike, right down to the tassels and the bell and the basket on the front. She would want them to catch the perpetrator right away and return her bike. But victims who've experienced trauma don't respond that way. Because my daughter would not be worried for a moment of like, what would the family think if they knew her bike was stolen? Would they still love me? Would they still want me? She wouldn't. I mean, she was not thinking, what will my friends think if they find out that my bike got stolen? Like, would they still want to be my friend? She wasn't thinking, is the faith community I grew up in, are they going to condemn me eternally because my bike was stolen? But you take a victim who's been sold repeatedly for sex in a commercial environment, who has been traumatized, whose identity has been taken from her, who's been branded perhaps, who's experienced all sorts of things, or been forced to do other criminal activity in addition to selling commercial sex. She might very well think, if my parents find out about this, they may not love me anymore. If my friends find out about this, I'm not getting invited to any of the parties. Like if my faith leaders find out about this, I might be condemned. And so they're not inclined to tell the police everything. They're not going to give a full and accurate description on day one. And so you have to investigate it by going more slowly. You have to give time for them to stabilize, time for them to begin to trust you, particularly in a law enforcement capacity where law enforcement may have been part of their exploitation. They may have really bad experiences with law enforcement and not want to trust them. And so it's going slow and recognizing that you're going to have lots of prior inconsistent statements. They're going to either progressively tell you, like they tell you a little truth, but not the whole truth, or they'll just lie to you outright from the beginning and then later on decide to tell you what really happened. But it's going slow. It's letting them have some agency. Trauma-informed includes like them making some decisions about when the interview happens or where they sit in the room or what food they're going to consume. Many of those choices were taken from them by the trafficker. And so like it's just being victim-centered throughout the entire process.
Yeah. That's really helpful. And the analogy of your daughter's bicycle, that's really helpful. There's so many layers of trauma and shame. And as you were kind of unpacking that a little bit, I'm thinking in cultures, and I don't know if you saw this in places like India, but in cultures that are heavily shame-based, can it be even more difficult for the victim to come forward?
I think so. And another aspect of being trauma-informed is understanding the cultural implications and knowing that different, like who's going to conduct the interview? How do we, like, should there be a male interviewer or not? What does this survivor, what's her past experience and past culture? How will that affect the way that she communicates? I think it's worth taking that into consideration.
Yeah. Is it, I want to focus maybe on the U.S. now, just in terms of the legal framework, the legal environment. Do we have the right laws and it's a matter of simply using what we have, or are there still significant gaps in the laws, the tools that we give to law enforcement to deal with this problem from a legal standpoint?
So I think the answer is that we have the tools we need from a legal standpoint. In 2000, the federal law was created, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Yeah. And many states have laws on trafficking now, and they can all be improved. Like there's a lot of states that don't really have a comprehensive trafficking statute, but instead they're pulling from a lot of different statutes to cobble it together. But owning other people is illegal in the United States, and we have laws against it. And while we can make them better, and we should make them better as time goes on, the real task before us, I think, is not so much a legislative task. It's an implementation task. It's a prioritization task. Right now, it's a question of political will. Do we really want to tackle modern slavery in the United States? Are we willing to put the resources necessary to go and do it? And I know that we're in an environment where no one wants the government to spend more money, which is fine. I'm somewhat sympathetic to those ideas. This is one crucial role of government, and it's essential that we actually care about it sufficiently to root it out.
I'm glad to hear you say it's a question of political will. I want to pivot from that, but like, where have you seen it work well in the United States? Where has the law really done its job?
There are plenty of individual cases where things have gone really, really well. And the team at Homeland Security, FBI, and Justice that are the primary groups that are working these cases federally, from an individual case standpoint, they're killing it. They're doing a great, great job. The challenge is they're only doing so many individual cases. We need more of them being done. If we're going to scale the effort, more people need to have those protections. We've also seen a pattern regionally where we've had these anti-trafficking coordination teams called ACT teams in various federal districts. We've seen huge increases in the number of indictments on trafficking, on the number of convictions of traffickers, and the number of victims that have been served. And so like that would be a program worth investing in and scaling as things go forward. And then every now and then we'll find a district attorney somewhere who decides that they're going to prioritize it. And if the district attorney shouts down the chain of command, more of these cases, the chain of command will produce the cases. They're out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Is this something that, in your experience, does it transcend or override, I guess, the current kind of political divide between conservative and progressive? I mean, is there some level of agreement on the priority of this, or is it vulnerable like everything else, it seems, to political ideology?
You know, I think that trafficking has occupied some rare real estate in Washington, D.C., and that we've had champions on both sides of the aisle that have really tried to make this a priority and fighting trafficking to be one of their top issues. We could use some more champions, quite frankly, but it's been helpful. I will say that, like, from administration to administration, trafficking work has been prioritized, but it's been prioritized differently. The place where I think there is a divide is around the idea of decriminalizing commercial sexual activity. And there, I think we do have a bit of a divide within folks, but on whether you prioritize prosecution of traffickers might also be a place where there could be some vulnerability. But I think what we want to do is keep focusing on the common ground and trying to create more of it. Yeah.
Rare real estate. That about sums it up. It feels like there's very little of that these days. I'm just thinking, as we're talking of our conversation a few months ago, we talked broadly about this issue, and we talked as two guys that are trying to make a difference in it. What I'm curious about to hear more of from you, just in your experience in this movement, what do you see as some of the most powerful forces that perpetuate the norms? And so now I'm moving from the legal side to more of the cultural side, because it's a supply and demand business, and there's things that have been normalized that perpetuate this. So what are the most powerful forces that perpetuate norms of sexual exploitation? What have you seen that allows it to continue to proliferate?
I think fundamentally, the philosophical pivot point, I think, that undergirds all of this is whether or not people believe that everyone has human dignity. Like, do you believe that everyone has inherent value? So inherent rights, the rights that precede government and with which government should not interfere. If you get to a place where you don't think everyone is inherently valuable, you could start to treat them as a commodity. And this idea of human dignity is what can solve racism. Like if we actually believe everyone is created in the image of God, if you're a person of faith, or just Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says everyone has inherent rights. If you're coming from a secular perspective, if we actually believe that, then we don't treat people badly. We don't discriminate against them. We don't engage in gender-based violence. We don't commoditize human beings and sell their labor or take their bodies, because we fundamentally believe that they are valuable. They are, in a sense, our brother and sister. And so if you believe that everyone has human dignity, it shifts the underlying behaviors. And of course, if you would never purchase commercial sex from someone that you believed was someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's sister. You look at people differently. And I think for far too often, our culture has deviated from that natural law of human dignity. And whenever we do, we end up in cultural crises. We end up having institutionalized slavery. We end up engaging in activities that are inappropriate and that we shouldn't do.
I don't think in light of that, then it's not a stretch to say this is a crisis of belief in a way, right? It's like, what do we really believe about people?
I think that's right. How do we view others? How do we view the refugee, the wanderer? How do we view the kid who's bounced through 10 foster homes? Are they just damaged and spoiled and there's no real hope? Or do we view them as someone that has value and that we want to care for? I think it matters. The same people that are purchasing commercial sex are the same people that are not caring for the elderly. They're the same people that are not engaged in efforts to treat special needs kids with respect and dignity. It's the same underlying mindset. And what we need to do is change our mindset. And as individuals change their mindset and focus on people as valuable, I think our behaviors will fall in line.
Yeah. What are the things that you've seen that tend to erode people's belief in the dignity of other people? Like what are the things that threaten that belief and that can deteriorate it over time?
I think it's an over focus on oneself and just what I want. What are my appetites? And constantly wanting everyone else to serve me. And so it starts, I think, with this root of selfishness that leads to an air of narcissism. So you ask any traditional victim of pimp-directed sex trafficking in the United States, and they'll all tell you, almost to a person, that one of the things that was shouted at them by their trafficker was, "Go get me my money." It's a sentence that almost every pimp-directed sex trafficking perpetrator says. And it's this sense that they're entitled to money, and this person is going to go out and sell themselves and get me my money. It's already mine. Someone else has it, and I want it. It's a complete focus on oneself, to the point where you're going to force other people to engage in unbelievable pain in order for you to get what you believe is already yours, even though it's not yours.
Yeah. And we have, on our side at Epik, we've had probably countless at this point conversations with buyers who have they exhibit that very same attitude. This is something I'm entitled to. And how dare you get in the way of what I'm entitled to? That sense of masculine sexual entitlement. Kind of along those same lines, looking at just from a cultural lens, and actually as a dad too. I mean, where do you see, if you see it, and I'm hoping you see it, where do you see hope in our culture for change in response to this?
Oh, I see so many reasons for hope. This is an incredible season. And let me just be clear that poverty is not caused, it's the default. People behaving badly is the default. That's the sort of human nature that we have. So for people of faith, it's original sin and fallenness. For everybody else, it's just obvious. I'm less interested in the question of why is there evil in the world, and I'm more interested in the question of why is there good? I'm not surprised when I travel and I see poverty, but when I see flourishing, I get excited, because this is what we want. We want more joy. We want more people to experience full flourishing in what they do. And so more than trying to stop what is wrong, we really want to promote what is right. And what I see in so many examples is having people drawn to the opportunity when they finally believe there's a hope for their future, that they can get inspired and they can do good.
Wow. Yeah, that I love the idea of flourishing. Yeah. I'm just looking through my list of questions because I don't want to leave that too soon. So what does it look like? Let's take that idea of flourishing for a second. Think about young men. Your kids are how old now? One's in
22 to 13.
Okay. So your 13-year-old, that's your son, right?
Yep.
Yeah. What do you envision? What should flourishing look like for your 13-year-old son and his friends in the next 10 years? What do you want for him that he could look back and go, I flourished during that season? What do you want for him?
Yeah. So I think one thing that it definitely involves is community. One thing that I constantly am thinking about for him is I want him to have a great group of friends that spur him on, that challenge him, that encourage him, that pace him. And building that community of friends, building that a place where you are known and you have an opportunity to engage is critical. It's within a great group of friends, within a community that I think he'll achieve more academically. He'll achieve more athletically. All those sorts of measurements. He's going to end up with lots of trophies, I have no doubt. But the thing he'll remember when the trophies all get thrown away, and every trophy ends up in a landfill, every single one. What he'll remember is the community of friends. And wonderful for me this past week, I got to gather with a bunch of my buddies from high school and middle school at a wedding. Wow. It's just this sense that we've been together for so long. We've seen each other mess up. We've great stories to laugh and make fun of each other. But this sense of brotherhood, this sense of friendship, I think we flourish best in community. And so that can be family. It could be people that we gather around us. But whatever activity we're going to engage in, we're going to engage in best if we have strong community. And that doesn't mean group work. You could pull back and do a big writing project where it's just you and your writing in your writing shed, but you're still coming out of that back into a community.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would believe, I know this is true from my own experience as a dad, you and your wife both have to prioritize everything to make that community happen. Right. I mean, you have to put them in places where they can experience that. And that requires sacrifice and forethought on your part as mom and dad. Do you, in your more reflective moments, you're thinking about your family, do you feel like you've always done that well? Or are there things at this season of your life as a dad that you would do different or maybe reprioritize?
One aspect of it that I think has been helpful for us to understand is that we're not in control of that outcome. Control is a fraud. None of us are in control of anything really, but we do have influence. We can have influence over the outcome, and so we can have influence over our kids developing into that community. We can help them obviously influence their academics, but they've got to take the test, right? We can influence it by how we engage and by what we model, by what we appreciate, what we encourage, how we talk at the dinner table, how we think, what we emphasize in others, and how we come along folks who are hurting. What does it look like? We also can see that traffickers, they know this too, which is why one of the most common coercive techniques is isolation. Isolating people from their language group, isolating people from their former community, isolating people from their faith community. Traffickers do this over and over and over again because they know that people will flourish in community.
Yeah, and they know how to do it well, for sure. What is your, just back to the dad thing and just being a dad, what is your most recent dad fail? If you could if you would care to share? Because you're like this super accomplished guy who has a lot of influence and is doing amazing things. But I know just from our little bit of kind of exchange that you're also just a normal guy. Like, what was your most recent just fail?
I'll share it's not quite recent, but it's a great sense of a fail. My daughter in middle school was doing really well, and she had just published an article in the literary magazine for her school, and I was just so proud of her. And it's her 8th grade year. She came home and told me she wanted to try out for cheerleading that spring for the 9th grade as she rose into the 9th grade. And my first instinct was, why would you do that? You're smart. And it was a terrible thing to say. And it really reflected, and I was like, why did I just do that? And I had friends in high school that were cheerleaders that were super smart. I just got sucked into a negative stereotype. And instead of listening to her and asking a more thoughtful question, like, what made you interested in that? Why are you excited about that? Like a curiosity question. I immediately went to just stuffing down her excitement about something that she cared about. And when I look back on that, it was absolutely because I was focused on me. I was frustrated with some stuff at work, and I was focused on myself. And because of that, I make this statement that I then spent the next 4 years digging out of, because she did make varsity cheerleading her freshman year. And I drove her to so many cheer gyms and competitions and sat on the floor of gyms all weekend while people tossed her in the air. I learned all of the vocabulary for cheerleading and all the nuances and words. I spent a lot of money on oversized hair bows, and as is my penance for that era. And she did really well. I was super proud of her. She also continued to do well academically and move on. But I think that what I remember about that parenting fail was that, like, I'm probably not going to be failing if I'm focused on loving. Like, if I'm focused on loving my kids, then the likelihood of success is high. If I'm focused on what I want and my needs, or how they're inconveniencing me, or how I need to get other things done, the likelihood of error increases.
That feels real counterintuitive when I hear you say it, because as a man, you've had quite an accomplished professional career, and yet you've been able to manage that tension. You usually hear so many stories about dads who have committed everything to their career and nothing to their family, and but you've been able to walk that line. So far.
I hope so.
So far.
I hope so. Yeah, so far.
Yeah.
There have definitely been days where I'm sure, like, the travel's been hard on the kids. Like I mentioned, it's been hard on my wife. But they also see the upsides of it, and they see the benefits of what we do. But yeah, I think far too often we think that the traditional role of a provider is roof and shelter, and that and food. And those matter. Like, we need those things. But what we're really supposed to provide is an environment where we can actually reach the goal of parenting. So the goal of parenting is not to have well-behaved children. The goal of parenting is to launch successful adults. And if that's our goal, that's what we want to provide as an environment where these adults can launch. It means that we have to model how we deal with adversity, how we deal with unemployment, how we deal with conflict. I remember one time we talked about conflict so much for weeks with our kids, and how we can do things. And our family was getting ready for church in the morning. We were running a little behind. I was in the driver's seat waiting for my wife, a little frustrated. The kids are in the back seat munching on their Cheerios. And my wife gets in the car, and she basically was like, "Hey, I'm sorry I'm running behind." I'm like, "This is really frustrating." And she said, "I understand. Like, if you could do this differently next time, it would help me." Talked about it. Finally, the back seat chimes up, and they decide to give us commentary on how we were handling our conflict. And my son says, "Great job, Dad. Like, you communicated your feelings, but you didn't do it in a mean way. You didn't call her any names. You didn't raise your voice." My daughter's like, "Mom, you did really well in that interchange by accepting responsibility, but also asking Dad to help out differently next time." And we're like, "Man, what is going on here?" And we realized we've been trying to train them, because we know they're going to engage in conflict. We know that when they're married, they'll have conflict. We got to equip these kids in order to deal with the challenges the road of life is going to put up, whether it's dealing with conflict or dealing with anxiety, dealing with unemployment, dealing with like, what do you do when your investment you just made tanks and you made the wrong call? Like, how do you go home to the dinner table on that night and deal with your failure and deal with it with them in an age appropriate way?
That's amazing that your kids gave you that kind of feedback in real time. That must have been an incredible ride to church that morning.
It was hilarious. It was hilarious.
How old were they when they were giving that feedback?
Gosh, maybe like 4th or 5th grade.
Wow. That would be sobering for me. Like, oh, holy cow, they're actually listening. You know, like that would give me pause to realize, I think like my generation, my parents, like, you don't talk about stuff like that in front of the kids, and yet you did, and that was the result. That's pretty impressive. That's some high level mom and dad stuff right there. That's really cool.
We spent a lot of time thinking about this idea of with, like the principle of this preposition with, in that we want to be with our kids in whatever they're interested in. So if my kids get interested in a game or a topic or whatever, I'm going to join in. I want to be there with them. I want to know their friends. I want their friends to feel comfortable coming over. But we also want them to be with us and to be like with us, even in big decisions that we're making or challenges that we're having or frustrations, and let them see that those things exist so they're not surprised when those trials and difficulties come in their own lives, that, oh yeah, this is what life looks like. Life is not perfect, but we get to happen to it. We get to go out there with agency and start engaging and influencing what the outcomes of our life is going to be.
That's really helpful, that idea of with. Given what you've seen just professionally in the work that you've done in this movement, are there times where you have deliberately shielded your kids from some of the harsher realities that you're seeing?
There's got to be a filter. We want to engage in these ideas in an age appropriate way. So we talk to our kids about, like, there are people hurting other people, and we want to stop the women and men that are trafficking people, but we don't get into the details of how they're hurting them. Shield them from images and things like that. We don't get into all the details. Like big picture, top line ideas have been helpful, but not only do we need to shield our kids from it, but in some ways we need to shield ourselves from it, and know that these ideas and the violence in the world that so many people live under, it affects us and it affects the people around us. And we have to acknowledge that there is a lot of violence, and traffickers are just constantly scheming up new ways to hurt people. And as we stop them, we have to learn what those ways are. And as we try to prove it in court, we have to tell juries what those ways are. But we got to do it in a way that doesn't have a cascading or sort of waterfall effect of harm, where we're just passing along awful stories because they're interesting or because we think they'll shock people. But we want the pain to stop, not for it just to continue.
What have you learned just with respect to that trauma that's been helpful for you in walking that line? What are some of the things that have helped you personally deal with that trauma?
Yeah, I mean, there've been several times. I don't know that I've always dealt with it well. I remember one case I was doing in New York, and I was making a spreadsheet to keep track. We had about 168 women from Latin American countries that had all been trafficked, and I'm trying to keep them all straight in my head. So I'm making a spreadsheet and where they're from, and their birthday and their name, and kind of who harmed them, and try to put them into categories. And I realized I'm now reducing some of the worst things that have ever happened to these people to like rows and columns on a spreadsheet. Like this is, but I don't know another way to get my arms around the information and to keep track of everyone. And it was just a sense of like so much pain being reduced to something so trivial. And it just hit me. I just felt really overwhelmed in that moment as I was working late at night. And what I realized is I've got to have healthy patterns in my life. Like if you draw close to pain, if you draw close to these types of issues, it will act as a magnifier. It will magnify anything that's really good in your life and that's going well. And it will also magnify the crevices. It will magnify the weaknesses, the vices. Whatever is going poorly will also be magnified. And so we've got to, in a sense, like an athlete that's training for a big event, we have to discipline and train ourselves as we draw close to these big things, because like physical exercise, if that helps release some stuff, community, again, friends and family, people that you can talk to, that you can process things with, are incredibly important. But what you've got to have some healthy habits, some outlets, and you've got to be ready that if we're pursuing excellence in the work of freedom, or really pursuing excellence in anything, we have to up our game. And I think that's what's so much fun. I know your audience is focused on masculinity, and everyone talks about toxic masculinity. I think this drive to be awesome, to be our very best, could be maybe a positive aspect. And it's not limited to guys. Obviously, women are also driven to be excellent. But you have to train in a sense. We have to up our game and figure out how are we going to handle the difficult stories? How are we going to handle the ideas we can't get out of our head? Or how do we deal with the images that we just found on this guy's phone of little kids? Like that's now in my brain. How do I process that? How do I deal with that? Yeah. How do I deal with my anger that I feel when you see these injustices up close? And I think you got to have a plan, and you've got to do it with others.
Are there for you therapeutic and or spiritual or philosophical practices that help you deal with, like, what do you do with those images and the anger you feel? Like, are there things that have helped you over time?
Yeah, they're happening. One thing, there are a couple things that just help me in general. And so, like, if I'm in a season where I haven't been exercising and haven't been going to the gym, I find that's always a bad sign. Yeah. I do better when I'm regularly moving. The other thing that's helped me just in general is reading, is spending time reading a book and getting into other people's ideas and other people's stories. That's been really a beneficial practice. But I think there is a practice as well, more specifically about images, of taking those images and in meditation, taking those and putting them away, saying, this is a really awful thing, and I'm going to put this image away in a proverbial box, and I'm going to close it, and I'm not going to open up that box again. And I'm just like going to, in my mind, do that over and over again and say, it's real. Like this happened to someone. It breaks my heart. In many ways, a lot of the stuff that's out there online, they're just crime scene photos. For so many of these individuals, and we need a place for them. And so, like an exercise like that of like putting something away, I think has been helpful for me.
Yeah, I would imagine prosecutors, investigators. I've had many friends in those fields that have had to learn similar practices. That someone has to know, someone who has the possibility of changing outcomes has to know the full extent of the violence. But then, what do you do with it after it's done? So let me flip the question and ask, like, in light of all of that, in light of the work that you do and the weight that you've had to carry personally and professionally, you hinted at this a little bit already, but what is something that you do? You talked about reading, but are there other things you do that are really life-giving for you that help sustain you?
Like when we have free time, we love to get to the mountains and hike and just long walks in the wood, something that it serves no sort of utilitarian purpose. It produces nothing, but it just gets you into a different mindset. So being close to nature. Yeah. Rescuing fish from water is also a joy when I hear that go. If I can get a fish out of a lake or out of a river, it brings me an immense amount of joy.
That's an endorphin rush for sure. Which a particular kind of fish? Fly fishing, bait casting, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, fly fishing is the best. Like, I think I really enjoy it. I'm not very good at it, but I love to go whenever I can. But it's much easier and faster and cheaper to just get out there and catch some bass on a lure.
Yeah. When you said that sound of the reels, like, that's a beautiful sound. I know that sound not very well because I'm also I read a book years ago about fly fishing that describes my style, and the book was called Walking in a River Waving a Stick. That's what it is for me. So our tradition as such in these conversations, I want to give you the last word. I'm thinking our conversation earlier and talking about your son, like what is your last word for your son and his friends, either a wish or even a challenge? If you could assemble them all in your kitchen and give them something, what would you say?
I would say always be pursuing something. I think a lot of people are waiting for a sign. They're waiting for a passion to come to them. And passions do, we do get passionate about things, but I think we normally have to be moving to be led. And so like be pursuing something. And if later you decide that thing you're pursuing isn't the right thing, switch and just like go to make a left turn, go do something else. But like be pursuing something. And if you're pursuing excellence at least one thing in your life all the time, which could be like pursuing romance, pursuing fatherhood, pursuing a new skill or a new degree or a new certificate or a new fish, like whatever it is, like always be in pursuit. Because if we're striving for excellence, we're going to find a place where we're making big contributions.
That's so good. John Richmond, you're blessing to this work. I'm really privileged to be in it with people like you. I appreciate your wisdom. I think there's a book in you called Awesome Left Turns or something like that. That feels like who you are. So thank you so much for this conversation. We're really grateful for it.
Good to be with you, John.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epik Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epikproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epikproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.